Okay, this is the 6th of 9 talks in the series on archetypes in the way. So this time we are focusing on the shadow as an important functional archetype. So the title is Integrating the Shadow. So by the time we get this deep into the series, I think I'm going to give up trying to recap everything or encompass everything I've said so far. So I have to start assuming that you've got some remembrance of what we've been through, or that if you are listening to this on YouTube or later on video, and you haven't got much idea, then perhaps please look back at the earlier talks. Okay, so we're in the process of working through 4 key archetypal functions. So the last session was about the hero, and the shadow is the second that I'm going to talk about of these 4 key archetypal functions. And those 4 key archetypal functions are ways that we need to remain inspired. Reminders, you could say, that are important to us as humans to try to link together our experience in a helpful way over time, given how forgetful we are. So they help us to integrate our responses in the longer term. So just to kind of put the shadow in context with the other 4 archetypal functions a little bit. So we talked last time about the hero doing this with goals. So trying to maintain the long-termness and also the provisionality of our goals. So the hero can inspire us to do that when the symbolic heroes with that archetypal function inspire us, then they can do so by inspiring us to maintain our perseverance and our flexibility in pursuing goals. The anima animus, which will be next time, is concerned with relationships, particularly relationships with the other in some sense. And the 4th one, the God archetype, is concerned with our overall potential. So these are different ways we need to be inspired. Now, you might well ask, well, how does the shadow fit into that? How can we be inspired by the shadow? Because obviously the shadow is concerned with negative responses. It's the only one of those 4 archetypal functions that is basically negative, and it arises out of our negative responses of fear, disgust, anger, pushing stuff away in one way or another. But I think inspiration is needed, obviously for our positive judgments, but also for our negative ones as well. And the challenge there is to adapt our negative responses into the most helpful form. And that's what I see the value of the shadow archetype as being for us, to inspire us to challenge, to channel our negative responses to things in the most helpful way. Obviously it's very easy to get caught up in unhelpful negative responses of one kind or another. So that's the challenge. So that's why I'm going to start with some sort of kind of basic reflections on humans and threats, and how humans respond to threats. Because I think it's in that context that we need to think about where the shadow is coming from, if you like, and why it's important to us. After that, I'll talk a bit more about symbolism of the shadow and about the idea of evil, and I'll suggest a view of evil that might fit in with this, and then obviously about projecting and integrating the shadow. Okay, so a little bit about responding to threats generally. Yeah, let's start with just the facts of human experience. We have negative emotional responses to things. So if something's likely to harm us, or we think it might harm us, then we feel fear. If we need to mobilize energy in some way against something that we feel is attacking us, then we get angry. If we feel possibility of some sort of source of disease or some sort of insidious long-term threat, then we feel disgust. And if we feel some sort of threat to the stability of our relationships, then maybe we feel jealous. So you could say all of those sort of negative emotions have functions for us. So I don't want to be in the business of saying these are bad, let's get rid of them, because that's not going to happen. We're human, we got these things. We can obviously not be controlled by them. We can put them in a helpful context. We can channel them in helpful ways, but I don't think they're going to go away entirely. So we do have trouble though with our negative emotional responses, and I think you could throw a lot of light on that by reflecting on a sort of mismatch between our sort of longer term evolutionary starting point, so the ways that our body has become sort of geared to respond to things, and the complexity of civilized society and how different that is from how things were just a few thousand years ago even. So before, let's say before the Neolithic, or before civilization started really getting going, certainly before modern civilizations. So what are the differences? Well, these days there are lots of things that can trigger negative emotions easily, but they're actually quite beneficial to us. So, well, dentistry springs to mind as a great example. Yeah. Nobody likes dentistry. Nobody likes having their tooth drilled or whatever. But it's really helpful. So we have to sort of control our responses to that. Obviously not just hit the dentist because he's about to do something to our teeth. And drugs and surgery, obviously, sort of the use of authority to produce a sort of stable environment, like the beneficial aspects, at least, of the police, even if they've got other aspects in some cases. So there are things of long-term benefit that may trigger negative emotions as well. So negative emotions can't just be spilled, as it were, the most direct and immediate way we may feel them. Then there are a lot of things that may trigger fear that we can do nothing about. Perhaps a great one in the news at the moment is the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons in Russia or in Ukraine. And most of us can do absolutely nothing about it. If it happens, then it happens. We have very little influence on it, at least. But obviously, you've got longer term things, just death, suffering of various kinds that we can't really make much impression on, if anything. So perhaps those are things that have always been the case. Yeah, there are some things we can do nothing about, but some of those are new things. But in the old environment, in the development of humans, there were lots of dangerous animals, which are now much less of a threat in the controlled environments we tend to live in modern life, at least in most places. Maybe if you're in Australia, it's because and then even the threat of violence from other humans has massively reduced. So there's this amazing book by Steven Pinker called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which gives a whole load of evidence about how levels of violence have reduced through the ages. despite the 2 world wars and so on in modern times. So I just refer you to that if you're interested in that issue, rather than trying to argue this case. But it does seem to be very much the case that the world is a very much less violent place, taken as a whole, than it used to be. And yet somehow we're geared up towards a much more violent world, a world full of threats. So perhaps the bigger threats today come more from other humans of a certain kind. So other humans that don't share enough of our values. People who will engage in fraud or betrayal of sort of contracts or undermining of institutions. These are often long-term threats. Modern stresses tend to be long-term and long-lasting. So economic exploitation, for example, then you spend year after year grinding away at some soul-destroying job for a pittance, and that's really stressful. But our system isn't geared towards doing something about that. So we're geared towards short-term dangers, doing something about those. So we just get into reinforcing loops of stress response in those kinds of situations, which can be disastrous for our health. So that tendency, that kind of response to threats, it's a mismatch, isn't it? And obviously that's one of the areas where mindfulness can be of some help anyway, in helping us to at least limit excessive stress responses to some extent, depending on our situation. But the threats that do exist seem to come from humans on the whole, on average, seem to come from humans with certain absolutizing character traits. These are kind of, I think they're encapsulated in the intuitions that we seem to have developed or inherited, perhaps. Well, I won't speculate about how we inherited them, but we seem to have certain alerts to certain character traits which put us on guard. Here's a human that might be a threat, and we associate it with evil. So think of cruelty, for example, particularly where one person seems to regard others instrumentally, and they're happy to inflict any amount of suffering on them. Manipulativeness, obsessiveness, ruthlessness, or narrow goal orientation. So these are all kinds of character traits that you often find depicted in films and novels and so on as villainous, or at least things that we should look out for. So there does seem to be some helpfulness as well in our instincts about maybe instincts we've developed about the shadow, about things to be avoided, about ways of channeling our negative responses. These kinds of traits, if other people develop them and they seem to be more of a threat to us, they're also a problem for us because of their influence. So we can get into those states ourselves. We can get sucked into a culture of cruelty or manipulativeness, for example. An evil culture, you might call it. So all that's just kind of reflections on the kind of threats we face and the kinds of responses we have to them. I think we need to understand the shadow in that context. So the symbols of the shadow, whatever they are, so whatever we find to be reminiscence of the shadow or remind us of the shadow, can operate to help to remind us where genuine threats come from. which are probably associated more with those human character traits, which could occur in ourselves or in others, and could remind us that we need appropriate long-term responses to those character traits. And those long-term responses, there's kind of one word that sums them up for me, and that's contextualization. So not just reacting to evil by trying to eliminate it, but putting it in a bigger space. Okay, and I'm reminded also of the Serenity Prayer, which is, I think, an interesting element. It's actually quite recent, I think. It seems to have been composed by a theologian called Reinhold Niebuhr, but it's been passed on anonymously in all sorts of places. It just consists of 3 lines, the Serenity Prayer. So it says, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. So obviously there's a lot of threats we can't change. So there's no point having endless stress responses to those threats we can't change, or that it's not helpful to respond to in that way. But we can, be inspired to be courageous to change the things we can change. So it needs to be focused in the appropriate way. And in wider context, I think wisdom to know the difference, which I would see as developing from middle way practice in the broadest sense. So let's think then a little bit about shadow symbols. Okay, so like the other archetypal symbols, the shadow could potentially be symbolized by anything, but there are certain things obviously that are readily associated for us with negative emotions, and those tend to get recruited as symbols of the shadow. So at this point I could show you a few pictures which might be helpful. Okay, first picture. So this is maybe a sort of classic depiction of Satan or the devil. One of the interesting things about that traditional depiction of a shadow figure, sinister shadow figure, is that Satan is often depicted with goat features. In fact, this picture is called Devil Goat. So why is Satan associated with goats? Well, I think the answer is probably, although there may be some debate about this, but probably to do with Christian rejection of paganism. So Pan had these goat-like features, and we wanted to reject Pan, so Pan became the devil. That's one explanation anyway. It may not be entirely historically correct, I'm not sure, but that's one way of thinking about it. So that also tells us something about, our shadow symbols are very much the product of our culture and what we've learned to reject culturally quite often. Some of them, like darkness, so darkness behind the figure, are much more universal. Humans are often afraid of the dark because obviously things might spring on you out of it. So there's dangers associated with the dark. So let's try another picture. Okay, the Grim Reaper. Somebody's shadow figure, but interestingly, not one with much personality, as you can see from the empty hood. He has It's just a threat, isn't it? It's just the unknown threat. So death doesn't seem to have many of those human traits like manipulativeness or cruelty or anything. Death is just inevitable. It just comes along with his side and he cuts us all down, and that's it. So we may fear death, but maybe this is the kind of the aspect of the shadow that we need to learn to constantly conceptualize, so that death is, it's not something that's helpful to be afraid of. It's not something that's helpful to constantly get in a loop of anxiety about. So death has a context, maybe he has a role as a symbol, but he has a wider context. And then another picture. So some of the variations on the shadow, some really wonderful ones can be seen, particularly in the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch. So, I mean, and really need to look at the detail here to see some of this. So I will focus in on a bit of this picture. So a lot of disgust, I think, in Bosch, of things that induce disgust. So some mutations and body parts cut off from their owners, and things that remind you of insects or maybe other threatening things, or the things with animals' heads on humans' bodies, and lots of bottoms. Insides, so that's another disgust thing, isn't it? The insides of the body. And there's these separated organs. So that's very much associated with left hemisphere perceptions. So after, according to Ian McGilchrist, writing about left and right hemispheres, the people who are, the right hemisphere isn't working properly, or maybe they're schizophrenic, often have sort of views of body, or an obsession with body parts, and tend to see humans as sets of parts rather than as a whole, as a living whole. Whether that was going on for Bosch, I don't know. And then things like fire, of course. So fire is a source of danger. There's an army in the background there, war, destruction. So lots of things that might invoke negative emotions for us, and so you can spend a lot of time picking through this and identifying the kinds of things that are related to our negative emotions, and the ways they can be expressed in all kinds of bizarre ways. Anyway, so that will just give you a taste maybe of some traditional shadow symbols. But I suppose the other thing about shadow symbols is that we all have our own, and most of us, most of the time, particularly in modern times, I think, don't dwell on Satan a lot of the time. We don't, we're much more likely to have our own sort of hated people or hate objects that are maybe politicians or authority figures of some kind, maybe relatives even, but who knows? So dependent on our own situation. So it's probably more people, focusing on Vladimir Putin, for example, as a shadow figure than focusing on Satan. Okay, so shadow appears in all sorts of ways. I'd like to just say a little bit then also about evil, and the way this relates to our ideas about evil. Because I think if you try and see the shadow in the context of practice in another way, then that involves a challenge to some traditional ideas about evil. So the traditional Christian view of evil often seems to be that it's chaotic. So in Paradise Lost, for example, hell is associated with chaotic rejection of the order of heaven, and Satan and the fallen angels all descend into this pandemonium. It's called pandemonium, has become a term for chaos. St. Augustine talked about evil as the privation of good. So this is very much a dominant traditional theological view of it, I think, that good is prior. So good is kind of metaphysically established and comes from God, and evil is just perversion of that, or just a limitation of it. And that means that obviously in the traditional theistic view, you have to fit everything into a model which involves God's dominance. So Satan is still operates through God's permission, is subsidiary to God, even though he's interferes with human life. So this kind of view of things assumes that good is metaphysical and evil is a reaction to it. Personally, I think it's better to turn that around, really, because if we're trying to identify relatively clear forms of good or evil, then it's generally, I think, much easier to identify evil. So we can identify evil in our experience over time when we encounter an unintegrated response, and the absolutized view behind that, absolutized approach to things involved in that unintegrated response. So we can see that in perspective when we're a bit more integrated, and we can look back and think, oh, at that point, I was in this very narrow state of mind. I was jealous, or I was cruel, or I was manipulative, and I wasn't seeing the wider picture. Or maybe we think of somebody else like that as well. So that we can identify as evil, and it doesn't have to be perfectly anything. It's just its distinguishing characteristic is just that it thinks it's got the whole picture at the time when it hasn't. That seems to be easier to identify than good, because we all have a sense of what's good, perhaps, which is very much based on what's familiar and what's we see as beneficial. But all those, what's good for one person can be not so good for another one. So it's based on a very partial view usually, and it's very easy for us to mistake that partial good for us as a universal good. So that's why I'm suggesting, and this really fits in with the middle way, I think, as a strategy, that avoiding evil is probably a better justified strategy than aiming to do, well, certainly aiming to do absolutely good. In a way, but in a way, good as we experience it is indistinguishable from avoiding evil. It's making the best of what we can, being adequate in our situation. There's also traditionally, again, coming back to St. Augustine, who wrote a lot about these things, there's also a distinction between two sorts of evil, natural evil and moral evil. So natural evil is things like earthquakes and volcanoes and hurricanes, so things that we can't do anything about, which are just part of the workings of the planet. Perhaps it would also cover things like cancer or other diseases. Whereas moral evil comes from human judgment and human action. So I think that's a rather more helpful distinction to make, because it's trying to distinguish between sort of unescapable, unavoidable sources of suffering, which we may feel to be bad, and moral evil, which we can work with, which we can actually do something about. So that's where I think moral evil can be understood in terms of absolutization, whereas obviously natural evil is nothing to do with that. You know, volcanoes are absolutizing; they're just volcanoes; they're just doing their thing. And I think that's an insight which does appear from time to time. It's not in much official theology or discussion of this, but a couple of quotes that capture it, or seem to have captured it. Paul Tillich was a 20th century somewhat radical theologian who wrote, "The demonic is the elevation of something conditional to unconditional significance." So his view of the demonic seems to be in harmony there with the idea that, you know, thinking that we have the whole story. Yeah, so giving unconditional significance. So the demons think they have the whole story when they don't. And then Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher, evil is the systematic substitution of the abstract for the concrete. So again, that relates to sort of absolutizing, very dominant left hemisphere approach to things. So there's some intuitions there, I think, from both of those thinkers about some helpful ways of understanding evil, I think. But a lot of the discussion about this traditionally has been about the so-called problem of evil, which is, you know, how can you reconcile a good God who allows evil to happen, which all assumes that God is omnipotent and supernatural. So that's a bit of a diversion, I think, really, from the ways that evil can be a helpful concept to us in our experience. Okay, so let me focus back on the practical stuff then. So finally, projecting the shadow and integrating the shadow. So how can we work with moral evil, let's say, which can be symbolized for us by the shadow? So projecting the shadow is I think it's the other thing about evil here is that evil can consist in its own projection, so as well as other forms of projection. So believing that evil exists in a sense, in a way that's separate from us, and it's not our responsibility, it's the fault of things out there. So that's the projection, whether it's Satan that's making it happen, or whether it's the boss or Vladimir Putin or whoever it is. Now, obviously, there's a complex relationships amongst all those things out there, but the belief that evil is just the fault of those things is projection. So the belief in Satan as a supernatural entity is an obvious example of projecting the shadow. And more commonly, the belief that another person or a group or an institution or a tradition is evil as a whole. So whether it's Hitler was evil, whether it's Christianity is evil, you know, any if you're taking a whole person or institution or tradition or whatever, these things are complex, and we're then simplifying them into one trait. So I think it's possible to take evil seriously without projecting evil. So whilst recognizing that persons and groups and so on are complex systems, so I don't think there's any justification just for saying that a whole person or a whole group or whatever is evil. I think we can talk about evil character traits, which I just did a little while ago. But a character trait is not a whole of a person, so it's one aspect of a person. If you described a person as cruel, that would be based on a number of experiences of that person behaving in a particular way. But they would obviously behave in other ways at other times. So evil character traits are patterns of judgment, and it seems to me to come down to judgment. When we can make a difference is when we make a judgment at a particular point. Okay, so if we project the shadow, we're not taking responsibility for our role in it, and to put it mildly, it's responsible for massive amounts of unnecessary conflict. So you think of from every level, from the family quarrel through to a world war, there's all sorts of conflict which could be avoided if people didn't assume that the complex other they're dealing with wasn't entirely evil. They were willing to engage more with the complexity of who they are, not to immediately think they're angels, but to recognize that complexity instead. So recognizing complexity comes very much with integrating the shadow as a practice. So that involves recognizing that the shadow is our response to phenomena. It's not a feature of the things in themselves. I take responsibility for that response. So that's one side of it. The other side is not reacting to the other extreme, which is assuming that evil does not exist. So because evil is not identifiable, you can't make a supernatural entity into evil. It doesn't follow from that there's no such thing as evil. So rather seeking more complex and adequate understandings of evil. So I think to integrate the shadow, that's entirely compatible with continuing to avoid genuine threats. That's a normal human function. At least avoiding genuine threats in a way that's helpful in the longer term. So obviously, let's say someone burgling your house is a genuine threat, but if you're constantly anxious about it and you wake up 5 times a night thinking there's a burglar, that's not a helpful response to that genuine threat. So it's also, it's not just that the threat is genuine, but also that you're responding to it in a way that's adapted to the situation and to the scale of the threat. So integrating the shadow involves distinguishing genuine threats from projected threats and from suffering that we can't avoid. And then experiencing shadow symbols as prompts to avoid genuine threats. So that's the perhaps the most difficult bit, maybe, if you're used to either dismissing, say, or other symbols of the shadow as non-existent, perhaps, to take them seriously, but to take them as having a relationship to what threatens you, what genuinely threatens you, or what could helpfully be understood as threatening you and responded to. And then, most importantly, when integrating the shadow, putting projected threats into a wider context. So whether that's a context of unavoidability. So let's take the example of death. So you feel death to be a threat, maybe you're anxious about death, but they put it in the context of unavoidability. reflect as far as you can on the fact that it's unavoidable, so therefore it's not something to fill the whole space, to be the whole picture. Another kind of wider context, compassion. So compassion practices put threats in a bigger emotional context, and that's where I think some of the compassion practices in Buddhism, like the metta bhavana or cultivation of loving kindness, can help people here by helping to create a wider emotional context in which to place their sources of stress or their symbols of stress. Or finally, putting projected threats into a more complex context. Seeing some of the other ways that this system works, I mean, it starts really just by reflecting that this thing we're projecting onto is a system, not just a thing. Okay, so that's probably the most important point to end on, really, that integrating the shadow is really done by putting projected threats into a wider context, which could be a context of unavoidability, of compassion, or complexity. So I'm going to stop there and over to you for any comments or thoughts. So this time, as we agreed, I'm going to try and go round to get a response from each person. So you would like to go first?
I'd like to make sure I understand that the negative feelings that arise from a situation is the inspiration from the shadow archetype. Do I have that right?
Well, the inspiration from the shadow archetype is the inspiration to channel the negative emotion appropriately that we have in response to a person or whatever it is that gives rise to that negative response.
Okay.
So it's obviously it's not an inspiration to have the negative emotion. It's assumed we've got those already.
Yeah.
It's an inspiration to channel that negative emotion in a helpful way. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Great. And Laura, you want to?
I guess these are comments. I was struck in the symbols of the shadow with, say, the Bosch symbols as well as the Pan symbol, the kind of mixed human and animal forms. And it struck me that I was sort of musing about this while you were teaching, but I was thinking about an experience recently where the fact of our human stress response was something that it was hard for someone that I was having a kind of discussion that was a rumbling argument going on, that the idea that our stress response, in a way, our bodies and how our stress response operates is something that we can mitigate to some extent through mindfulness and practices like that, but that it is what our bodies are like. Dealing with short-term stressors our cortisol, peaks and so on.
Mm.
And the way this played out was a person was denying that there's been any progress, say in the United States, about race, because race is such a serious problem today for the Black community in particular. And yet there clearly have been some improvements since, say, the pre-civil rights era of say, around the 60s or 50s. And this person was saying that those improvements don't matter. And my idea was that they do matter in that they lower the stress of everyday life for Black people, and that matters. And he was saying, well, that just buys off people, that it doesn't really matter. And it just, I'm a little unfocused about this, but it seems like going on there is this kind of not placing in a bigger context the sense of how our bodies are, that if we are less stressed out by, say, practicing mindfulness or having better life conditions, that we may be able to operate in a bigger context to solve the sort of problems that seem like evils in our lives. Anyway, it just, and the other thing is just a comment that for me, right away, I went to the death figure, the Grim Reaper, as a symbol that I would go to talk about the shadow. And it's sort of that the Grim Reaper for me is precisely placing an unavoidable human bodily fact in a very narrow context where it doesn't have beauty, meaning, the whole of life placed in the context of a whole life. And so anyway, that was, my sense was that I could channel the message of the Grim Reaper, which is that life is unavoidable and it's going to come to you no matter what you want. In that wider context, that the fragility of life is something that I can see very differently from that kind of meaninglessness of the Grim Reaper. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, these symbols seem quite universal. They're very widespread anyway. The Grim Reaper is very widespread, but it could mean very different things to different people, couldn't it? But so for one person, it may just immediately trigger a fear of death, which is perhaps worse because it's felt to be inevitable. Yeah, because making that person feel powerless. But for other people, it could be a trigger to reflect on death as something we can't do anything about, but that we've accepted as part of a bigger picture. So it's almost like, and I've seen some cartoons and things which put the Grim Reaper in a slightly bigger, somewhat funny context, and that seems to be the kind of help. If you've got the Grim Reaper sitting on a bus with a row of people, then it's humanized. It's become part of that human situation.
I was also just quickly, your idea of channeling into a more positive and channeling negative responses into a more positive framework. I was thinking about, the idea of the human and animal bodied symbols. And I was thinking about the great, great poems like Gilgamesh, where this idea of human and a human being part animal was worked over centuries in the telling of this story, to where there was just a great sadness at the leaving of our animal selves behind. And I felt like that was a wonderful example of, I mean, I guess in other art and so on, we could find examples of the channeling of the shadow in a magnificent way. So anyway, I thought of Gilgamesh with Bosch. I was thinking of Gilgamesh as well.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that the animal elements can be shadow symbols, but obviously animals can also be animus, or even God-like figures or heroes. Yeah. Okay, great, thank you. James, do you want to?
Yeah, really interesting. Lots of little things. One thing that I thought of when you were talking about symbols of evil, it reminded me of one of Clive Barker's books, who you could consider sort of writes occult fantasy, I guess would be a good example. And one of the evils, I guess you could say, in his book was described as having kind of unending detail. So when you brought up the Bosch image, it made me think of, you know, the kind of the devil in the detail sort of symbolism, which was quite interesting. I liked the changing of context. So, and Laura was talking about the Grim Reaper. And I recently saw an interview with the author Neil Gaiman, where, well, it wasn't an interview, he was answering questions from Twitter, and one of the questions was about a graphic novel that he'd written that included death. But death was depicted as this kind of cute, giggly little girl sort of thing. And so the question was asked, why did you decide to depict death in that way? Because it seems to be quite different. And I really liked his answer, because he said, well, you know, if you look at least some ways in which death is talked about as a figure, it's the thing that's accompanying you to the underworld or the afterlife or whatever. And he said, I just thought of, you know, he said that's a really nice thing to do, right? And, you know, he's providing company to you. And so I thought, you know, can we reframe it a little bit and bring out the niceness of it? So I feel like that's an example of kind of expanding that context a bit. I also happen to have various depictions of skulls and skeletons in various bits of artwork throughout my house as well. So I guess I don't necessarily connect with the idea of at least the visage of death as being kind of particularly evil. So that was interesting. The other thing that I thought about when you started speaking about evil, my immediate reaction was, well, there is no evil because it's all context dependent, isn't it? And I was having a conversation the other day with my wife, and we were talking about serial killers, because we'd watched something about Jeffrey Dahmer. And I was recounting that I'd seen a documentary a long time ago that was kind of positing the question of, is he mad or is he bad? You know, is it mental health or is it evil? And it really made me think that I have a hard time calling something evil, because that seems like a very absolute way of describing something. But I probably describe some things as good. So I think that's probably worth looking at. Yeah, I mean, Putin's a good example, right? Because I'm pretty sure Putin doesn't think he's evil. I'm pretty sure he probably thinks he's doing a good thing. And it also reminded me of the David Mitchell skit where they're dressed as Nazis, and he turns around to whoever he's with and he says, "Are we the bad guys?" So yeah, kind of a bit of scattershot there, but yeah, really interesting. And one thing that I did notice is you were talking a lot about kind of external sources of evil. A lot of other groups that I've been involved with, where they talk about shadows, they tend to talk about like the shadow side, so the negative sides of ourselves, that whatever. I was wondering if you had any comments on that side of things in this context.
Yeah, well, that's an aspect of the projection, I'd say. So obviously we can project the shadow in ourselves. You know, if we become obsessed with a part of ourselves that we reject. But also, yeah, there's the danger of not acknowledging the shadow in ourselves in the sense of not acknowledging negative emotions, basically, the sources of negative emotions. So I suppose that rather than kind of talking that language about facing up to the shadow inside, I started to talk more about just that we all face threats, and just normal human responses to have negative emotions. So I want to kind of challenge this kind of it's quite an enculturated thing, I think, to see negative emotions as bad, but their response is something which channeled in the right way can be entirely appropriate. But it's the ways that those emotions get stuck and think about the whole story that creates all the problems.
Yeah, and the thing that reminded me when you were talking about, I think the inevitability of negative emotions, which I think I would agree with you, was it reminded me of some of the quote unquote more traditional approaches in Buddhism, which would say that nirvana is, and full enlightenment is never having any type of negative emotion.
Mm-hmm.
Which
Seems to be an idealization.
Yeah, exactly.
As far as I can judge, yeah. But you were talking earlier about having skulls in your house, and that's a very traditional kind of Buddhist thing to do. That people put skulls on shrines and so on, and you find the skulls in the necklace of Padmasambhava and so on. These Tibetan figures that use lots of memento mori, and violence of death, and that all seems to be very healthy in the sense that it's putting death in a bigger context, and it's putting these reminders in a larger, more integrated context. So that's, it could be that the skull in some ways evokes the shadow, but if that evocation has a context, then you're integrating the shadow. So it's I suppose there's a danger that's just it's my experience, I suppose, that if you have too many memento mori around, you just get used to them and you can stop having an effect after a while. But they still could potentially have that effect.
But the other, when you were mentioning disgust, the other practice that I was reminded of some of the Theravadan practices is on, thinking of the human body as disgusting, essentially, to lead to a decrease in body attachment. I think that might be an interesting example of what would be generally considered a negative emotion that is being kind of co-opted for, and I guess in this case, liberation, which is not a common approach taken in a lot of the Theravadan approaches.
Yeah, it seems quite a dangerous practice to me, or unhealthy perhaps, but in that at least not unless it's very heavily contextualized anyway. So because there's this danger of rejecting our bodies anyway, I suppose, particularly with the whole Platonic kind of way of thinking that's becoming cultivated in the West, sort of the assumption that we are minds that aren't our bodies, and therefore we can look on our bodies and be disgusted by them and be separated from them, and this is good. So there's a danger of getting straight into disembodiment, I would have thought, if you sort of cultivate disgust of the body in that way.
Yeah, I think the typical context for that sort of practice is, an all male monastic setting, which I think, changes the way in which, and of course they use it it can be used as a way of dealing with desirous thoughts, especially in the opposite sex, if that's your inclination. So it's not a practice that I think is going to be picked up particularly widely in modern Western approaches.
Yeah, I mean, there's this danger of using antidotes rather than contextualizations generally. I think. But so if you're experiencing a lot of desire, then you introduce negative emotion as an immediate antidote. Then you may just swing from one to the other, rather than finding the middle way, which would contextualize both of the negative and positive emotions. Anyway, George, would you want to come in with anything?
Yeah, thanks very much. Very interesting to hear the different thoughts and questions. I think firstly for me, I'm wondering why you choose to use the word evil as a useful middle way approach. Because as James has said, it seems of its very nature to smack of absolutization, and why that is particularly a helpful way of describing it. I know that you're interested in this sort of embodied meaning way of looking at life, and that talks a lot about the kind of language that you use, the metaphors that you use, and how they actually box you into particular ways of interpreting the world, and as a result responding to and seeing the world. So they seem to have a very deep set power to affect how we see the world and how the world appears to us. So I just wonder why you chose to use a word like evil as an important way to help us contextualize.
Well, I think it's when people, as they often seem to these days, try not to use the term evil, it seems to slip in. We think we get it anyway. And that seems to be a result of negative emotion. So like James mentioned, murderers or whatever. So there's this sense of evil which seems to be rooted in our negative emotions. So in a way, well, assuming that evil is always absolutizing, is it will for me be an aspect of sort of giving up on the middle way in a way to assume that we're always going to be in these absolutizing states and there's no way around it. But if there is a middle way, if there is a way we can practice and work with these things, then I think we need to acknowledge them, and that means acknowledging evil, but contextualizing it. And part of the way we can do that is coming back to the distinction between meaning and belief that I've been talking about earlier in this series. That we can find evil meaningful and work with that meaning or be inspired by that meaning without having absolute beliefs about it. So the belief that so and so is evil, for example, that would be an example of an absolute belief. But just the term, the concept evil by itself, I don't think it's absolute. There's no such thing as an absolute concept. It's got to be in a proposition. It's got to be in a potential belief to be absolute, be absolutizing.
I was quite struck by when Anne-Laurie was talking about her relationship to death and the way she can sometimes think about it in terms of potentially being a beautiful element or having some other kind of qualities or ways of seeing it. And I was thinking about, the ideas that we often use metaphors of war to describe lots of different activities that we're doing. And I just wondered if you took a whole other set of metaphors to look at this whole problem of the shadow, then if that doesn't just by itself start to diffuse things dramatically. So yeah, I'm not quite sure where evil starts, You know, when you're saying, well, you have to acknowledge that there is evil. Well, where does evil start? Because you often talk about, you know, the sliding scale of things.
Sure, but it starts in our negative emotions, as I say. So the moment you know, something threatens you, or it becomes an object of rejection. Say you're swatting a fly or a mosquito or something, that becomes evil. You know, that's fair enough. You know, it's a very limited context, isn't it? Where that's become evil for you in that very limited situation. And obviously, if you scale that out, the fly isn't evil at all. Fly is part of the ecosystem, which is fine. If we integrate our view of evil, then we can get an increasingly adequate view of what is genuinely evil in this wider sense, rather than just on the basis of a very limited view. But we can't start off by denying that we have this limited view and these negative emotions which will operate in this in almost any context where we react negatively to something.
So you're using evil as a word to denote a negative, a limited viewpoint. Is that the key thing about it?
Yeah, that's right. So I mean, it is an absolutizing limited viewpoint. Yeah, particularly. I think that's the most helpful way of understanding the evil that we can identify and respond to as evil, is that is the human tendency to absolutize. So that's where I think moral evil is much more relevant to us than natural evil. You know, natural evil isn't evil once we've contextualized it. You know, the flies in the ecosystem, the volcanoes are part of the Earth's workings, etc. But human evil can be worked with and can be contextualized and can be changed, whether it's in us or in somebody else, whether in the psychological level or the socio-political level.
Okay, thank you.
And Laura? You're muted.
I saw. Is it that evil is? It sounds to me like we're talking about evil as a decontextualized threat that we react to, given our bodies and so on. We react to without any context of meaning, and so we have no management at all of its negativity. Whereas, yeah, is that part of what you're saying about what evil is?
Well, no, I think our responses to what we take to be evil are rooted in those negative responses, yes, which may start off being context free. But as we work with the concept of evil and work with our responses, which involve finding things or people evil, then yes, obviously we can make a difference. And we can particularly make a difference by trying to sort out what's genuinely a threat and what isn't. Okay. What's genuinely a threat is much more likely to involve human moral evil, which is likely to involve absolutization. Okay. So the symbols can be helpful by reminding us of the way absolutization can be a threat to us. I mean, that's where there's maybe a difference between symbols like, I don't know, the Grim Reaper or Satan, which are very sort of generic evil in the broadest sense, you know, symbols of that. But evil as it appears in villains. I'm thinking particularly of things like fantasy epics, so like Lord of the Rings, the figure of Sauron, or J.K. Rowling's Voldemort, figures like that. So sort of people that we imagine or fantasize to be evil, they often have these traits. which are absolutizing traits.
Mm.
So there seems to be something about that sort of level of engaging with evil seems to relate to some helpful intuitions. That's my suggestion. Anyway, there's a lot we could continue to discuss there, but we better get on to the practice focus for the next time. So yeah, I'll just run through the 5 reflections basically in the practice focus, and as usual there are different ways you could do these reflections. You could, for example, journal it, you can put it in a meditation, you can put it in a discussion, but suggestion is that you practice by reflecting on these things in one way or another. Okay, so the practice focus is called differentiating genuine from projected threats in our response to evil. So 5 stages in that. So first reflection, first stage, to reflect on what the threats are that you face. So what threats do you face? So that could be personal level or political level. So just to throw out a few examples, general sorts of examples, it might include conflicting relationships. It might include economic threats. I know you're about to be made bankrupt or something, or lose your income. Could be health problems. Could be sources of environmental degradation, environmental threats. Political threats, obviously, like being nuked by a foreign power or something, or self-sabotage. So it could be threats from within, like addiction, for example. So wanting to go back to something that some larger self doesn't feel is really you. Okay, so that's the first stage. What are the threats you face? Second stage of reflection, once you've got a sense of what your threats are, how are you responding to these threats? So are you able to avoid them? Are you able to contextualize them? Do you treat them in a helpfully long-term way? So that probably means, are you avoiding sort of repetitive feedback loop stress responses? So like continually worrying about this threat, for example. Or are you responding to it in a more effective way? Okay, so second stage then was how do you respond to these threats? Third stage, how are the threats symbolized or imagined in your experience? So that might be, for instance, as representative people, a person who really is evil as far as you're concerned. Could be imagined scenarios. So are you afraid of particular things happening that keep replaying in your mind? Are there demonized concepts? So is it just like a word or a concept of something that is demonized? Like you hate communism or something, you know? So if you're a 1950s McCarthyist, then you demonize communism. And that's the word, the concept that gets attached to everything bad. Okay, then fourth stage. So you've thought about the threats you face, how you're responding to those threats and how they're imagined. And then fourth is to ask yourself, how far do you project those threats? So do you assume that they're absolutely or independently evil? So is there any projection going on there? Another way of asking that is, do you feel some degree of responsibility for the threat you feel? Could be, in some cases, could be a very small responsibility, but it's still acknowledgement of responsibility. And then fifth, final stage. So place your shadow symbols in a larger context. So particularly if you are projecting threats, you've identified threats you're likely to project as shadow symbols, can you put those in a larger context? Okay, so you might do this conceptually by putting them in a larger system, thinking about them in a larger system. And that might include reflecting on ways that you can't do anything about the threat. Or you can imagine the shadow symbol in a larger context with varied motives and feelings. For example, you could imagine your evil boss playing with his children and being in a different mode. Or in terms of your feeling responses, you could connect a wider emotional context of compassion to arising from your embodied awareness. So this is probably best done in meditation. You start off with connecting with embodied awareness, connecting with a sense of compassion, and then thinking about a shadow symbol to give it a bigger emotional context. So the Buddhist metta-bhavana practice might be helpful with that approach. Okay, so very briefly then, just to run through those 5 stages again. So what are the threats you face? How are you responding to those threats? How are the threats symbolized or imagined in your experience? How far do you project those threats as absolute or independent? And then final stage, place your shadow symbols in a larger context. Okay.